So, Corey, let's talk about what happens next with this Venezuelan invasion, war, occupation. I mean, the reality is, if you want to believe it's about drugs, you have to ignore that Trump just pardoned the former Honduran president convicted of importing hundreds of tons of cocaine. If you want to believe this is about democracy and the good people of Venezuela, you have to believe Trump gives a damn about democratic legitimacy. If you want to believe this is about the Christian folks under siege in a 95% Christian country, you have to overlook the fact that Trump just broke 6 commandments and pretty much everything Jesus ever said. And to believe this was legal, you'd have to believe we still have a functioning Congress. Corey, Trump did not ask Congress. He didn't tell Congress. He did not get an authorization. He just did a war and then announced that we're going to run Venezuela for a while and let very large American corporations exploit its oil. So this is Donald Trump becoming what we said this was going to be, our hemisphere's Putin, kidnapping leaders, ignoring international law, ignoring borders when we feel like it, and using the military as our assassins, as our getaway car, and as our personal distraction device. Welcome to the Oath in the Office podcast, coming to you live from America, where the entire world now knows our president has had at least 3 dementia tests that he can remember. I'm John Fugelsang, joined as always by the star of the Oath in the Office podcast, professor and author of the book, The Oath in the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents, Corey Brettschneider. Corey, sorry it's a slow news week. Welcome back.
Yeah, wow. I mean, when we started this show, I was pretty confident that every week we would have some constitutional crisis to talk about, but it could have been the odds were against it, but it could have been that
humble. Also, constitutional challenges. They're not all crises, right? Some of them are just constitutional challenges that more competent generations could deal with. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. Friday night, after I got off the air on Sirius XM, Donald Trump finally illegally invaded Venezuela while we were asleep, which I thought was rude, Professor. If you're going to start a war, have the decency to do it during normal business hours like a proper sociopath. Monday, this week in New York, Maduro pled not guilty to charges of narco-terrorism, conspiracy, and other alleged crimes on his first day in U.S. federal court. Turns out the indictment against him and his wife is a little flimsy, rests very heavily on a meeting his wife had before he was ever president. But Donald Trump is treating it as a win. He began bragging about this on his website, that he bombed Venezuela, kidnapped the president, flown him out of the country. Corey, I have no doubt this will turn out every bit as smoothly as Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan and Haiti and Honduras. And we have to say this again, Maduro's a bad guy. He's corrupt, he's brutal, he's violent, he's very anti-democratic. But, I mean, I think the problem is Trump didn't overthrow a dictator. He may have officially become one. The administration insists the raid was not an act of war, but a law enforcement action to apprehend an indicted criminal, which is what they should have said the Afghanistan war was. I think Molly Ivan said Korea was a war they called a police action, and war on terror was a police action they called a war. But under the U.S. Constitution, let's just go to the basics. I know we haven't legally declared war in this country since 1941. Yeah. Who has the power to initiate war? And how narrow are the exceptions? What does Article 1 actually require? And what powers does Article 2 not give a president? I was writing down my questions watching the coverage all weekend for you.
Well, I think this is always a good thing to do. We'll come back, of course, to the case at hand and what I think is an egregious violation of international law and domestic law. But let's start with the basics. As you said, our Constitution does something that the British system of government didn't do. They combined the war powers of carrying out the war, acting as commander-in-chief, and also deciding whether or not to initiate a war in the crown, in the monarch. And the idea of the American founding was, this is too dangerous, that we really want to separate out the executive decisions about how to carry a war out, the commander-in-chief role, from the decision of whether or not to go to war. And the framers really knew that creating that division, and just to point out what they did to answer your question, Article 2 creates the president and limits it, and it gives the commander-in-chief power to the president. Article 1 gives the power to declare or initiate, in other words, initiate war to Congress. And they did that for a reason, which is that they wanted Congress to be careful. They knew that the decision to go to war wasn't just a, separate small foreign policy issue. It really would consume the nation. And so they'd rather be slow, deliberate in that decision. And that's why they gave it to the Congress, not to the president. Now, it is right to say that we haven't formally declared war in quite some time, but we have had resolutions. And to my mind, there really isn't a difference between declaring war and having resolutions. So we had an attempt to reclaim the war power in the War Powers Act at the end of the Nixon administration, which created rules for certain actions that could be within 30 or 60 days if they were military or even police actions, but required eventually an act by Congress. We had Congress, H.W. Bush didn't want to, in the Kuwait invasion, go to Congress, but he eventually was persuaded to do so. In the Iraq War, Congress deliberated and there was a vote. So, the counterexample to all this, which is what we'll get into, is Panama, which was a police action, the way that H.W. Bush put it. But I think that really doesn't fit what's going on here. I think this is a blatant violation of that requirement that Congress initiate war. And there's plenty of blame to go around, as we'll get into later. Part of the blame is Congress refusing to take the power for itself. Nobody's going to give you that power. The presidents always want to ignore Congress. And so part of the fault here is the U.S. Congress.
Sure. Well, I think the first casualty in American wars of the 21st century has been the English language and the way that the language has been abused to soften up a lot of illegal actions. And we talked about this a lot under the Bush presidency. And by golly, I talked about it a lot under the Obama presidency as well, how imminent threat means if we think this 12-year-old boy might grow up to be a terrorist, he's an imminent threat and we can kill him. We've seen lots of such abuses. So let me ask some really dumb questions here. Can a president lawfully invade a sovereign nation without any authorization from Congress simply by calling it a police action? Because this seems to be more of a rhetorical category than a legal category, Corey. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, I'm going to eventually agree with you. I think we're in heated agreement about the fact that this isn't a legal war. But there is an argument that I think we've got to put on the table, and we'll consider it, which is that in the Panama case, the argument was that Noriega was an unlawful dictator. He had come to power through a coup. And this wasn't a war, it was a police action to remove him, and that it was done with the cooperation of the Panamanian people. And in fact, the new leader of Panama, rightful leader of Panama, was sworn in the same night that they removed Noriega. So, so there is precedent, and there is a case, 11th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals did decide that, not that this was a legal war, but they gestured towards that idea by pointing out that Noriega had declared war on the United States. And so defensive wars are not aggressive wars, and there isn't a need for the president to have the consent of Congress.
Right.
So that's one difference. Ultimately they rejected the idea that this was the legitimate sovereign of Panama, so they rejected the sovereign immunity arguments.
I'm so glad the language worked out in their favor that way.
So I think that probably was an illegal action too, but there are many differences here. For one thing, there wasn't that kind of cooperation. I don't think, by the way, it was a police action, although I've given you a route to saying how it would be.
And like Venezuela, they lied about the reasons. Like Venezuela, they lied about the reasons too. That's very important, I think. But go on.
Yeah, in the Venezuela case, you heard Trump say that he met with oil executives, and didn't meet with Congress, and that's who he was collaborating with, and so his motivation is pretty transparent.
Trump's the only member of the Republican Party telling the truth about this invasion right now, Professor. Sorry, go ahead.
That actually is the theme. During the travel ban case, he often said, "Oh no, it is a Muslim ban," or "I preferred the first version of it, which was, clearly what I was trying to do, a complete, total shutdown of Muslim immigration into the United States." And here he's telling us it's about the oil. So so, he's got his legal rationale, and you get the sense that in the White House, everybody's like, okay, don't say the real reason. And there he comes out and says the real reason. This is either about, I think the other things it could be about, which is more frightening, is what's sometimes being referred to as the Trump doctrine, the desire to control and dominate Latin America, to eventually replace in Cuba the regime there.
Right.
Greenland, we were talking about.
Well, we'll get to that. Can I bring it back to Panama for a second? Because I have more dumb questions here again. Because I'm just the mook copying off your paper on the SAT day, Corey. But I still don't see how labeling changes constitutional reality. I mean, if what happened in Panama, which they're using as a precedent, wasn't actually a constitutional action at the time,
right?
Does something become lawful through repetition? I mean, is this a precedent, or is this? I said it on Sirius XM to you last night. This feels like precedent laundering to me.
I mean, the fact that it's been, a blunt way to put it, the same point, is the fact that it's been done before and that it was done by President H.W. Bush doesn't mean that it was lawful then. And I think there's a very good argument to suggest that it wasn't. There are these differences. I am possibly compelled by the idea that because Noriega had declared war on the United States, that this was a different category, that was a stupid thing to do. I think absent that, it would have been much harder to make the case. But, here, there's no such thing. Maduro didn't declare war on the United States. It was an aggressive war. And let me come back to basics. Look, Congress has the power, the sole power, to initiate war. And this is, going and bombing a foreign country, sending teams in to remove the leader. That is an aggressive act of war. And there is no laundering it by claiming it's a police action, because that's not the motivation. I don't think it would excuse it if it was, the details of the Panama case aside and the difficulties there. So even if that, I don't think that was a legal war, but even if it was, the precedent doesn't apply here.
I want to tell everyone, if you get a chance to rent the Academy Award winner for Outstanding Documentary, 1993, The Panama Deception, which explains what this was all about. Jimmy Carter was a little too Christian to these people, and so the Christian nationalists tried to take the Jesus out of that deal. Corey, here's another dumb one, because the people saying, oh, it's a war, and then the right wing saying, oh, no, it's the shortest war in history, it's already over. And if you believe that, I have a used Mission Accomplished banner I want to sell. Because this White House has no idea how to manage the post-Maduro Venezuela. They say we're going to run it. Does that mean Stephen Miller? Because things are going so well here. I mean, they really thought that military action was done when George Bush did his little photo op on the aircraft carrier, Corey. This military action may not be done. God help us if there's a violent resistance like we saw in Iraq that led to more deaths than the initial invasion. But what legal standard determines if something's a war versus a limited police action? Is it boots on the ground? Is it regime change? Is it occupation? Or is it theft of natural resources, which we have to talk about as well?
Well, I put it not at the duration. I put it about whether or not it's an act of defense, in which case the president might have the power to do it. But an act of aggressive war is an unprovoked use of force against a foreign power that doesn't want it. Now, again, and we could keep going into the Panama case, there arguably the United States was invited in by the lawful regime. So that's another difference. Here, that's definitely not the case. And you see the president saying and threatening the vice president of Venezuela and saying, as bad as what happened to Maduro, what will happen to her is worse.
Exactly.
That really gives the lie to the idea that this is some sort of police action, because she, what's the indictment against her?
That's it. But that's my big question here. I mean, Trump openly stated we're going to run it, and that we are going to extract their oil wealth. At what point does Trump's candor become a confession? I mean, doesn't on a legal level, doesn't him stating in front of cameras with functioning microphones, stating his intent to occupy and take resources, didn't he just destroy his administration's legal defense? Even if the indictment it isn't flimsy. I mean, he just said it.
I think that's a great way to put it. That that he's telling us the truth in the midst of this subterfuge, this lie that this is a police action. The idea that he wants to run Venezuela. Let's just get into that. I mean, what he's really doing is rediscovering this fun thing that, in his mind, fun thing, really horrible thing, of American colonialism.
That's it.
But here's a crazy little detail. Even in the horrific history of American colonialism, for instance, in the Spanish-American War, which led to America taking several colonies, there was a debate in Congress, and there was a declaration of war and an authorization of the use of force. And so even in that misguided moment, America realized, as bad as it was, that this can't be done unilaterally by a president. Getting involved in colonial running of other countries, if war takes up domestic resources, that really starts to strain the resources of the United States. And he wants to do it unilaterally. So let me just make my point. As bad as colonialism was, and it was horrific, at least they were better off. It wasn't a dictatorial move. It was an active decision of Congress.
So, Corey, would you say then that the Trump doctrine appears to be that the U.S. and Russia and China just carve up whatever weaker nations they want? I mean, that seems to be what the deal that's been cut means. And is there anything in American or international law that permits that sort of new world order?
Well, the idea that America is going to have any standing now to criticize the invasion of Ukraine or to criticize China as it threatens Taiwan, all of that starts to be a hard argument to make, because it looks like the United States is involved in this manifest destiny or colonial quest to take over other nations. And the idea that there's this ability. I mean, the Nuremberg trials were partly about crimes against humanity and the Holocaust, but they also were about aggressive war. And when Goering was put on trial, that was one of the main things that he was accused of. That set a precedent, which is that nations can't just, invade one another. It's a fundamental idea of international law. And really what Trump is doing is nothing less than undoing it. I mean, so that we have the domestic argument that we went through. He's usurping the power of Congress, and he's certainly undoing international law. Now, is it a doctrine? Is it a thought-out thing? He's, an impulsive person, not somebody who thinks theoretically, but he's certainly doing a huge amount of damage. He's the bull in the, just the bull in the shop, destroying, all of the remnants of law.
Yeah, I mean, that's the terrifying thing. If other nations now adopt this logic, like if the new paradigm is that Putin is Hitler and Trump is Mussolini, if China cites this as justification for seizing Taiwan, do we have any legal rebuttal left? I'm not that sure this administration would object at this point.
It could be, in their minds, a willingness to carve up the world among these three powers. But what's really unfortunate is, it's fledgling international law, but at least those principles are there. And that when Putin invaded Ukraine, the world could say, that's not allowed under our post-World War II consensus. And if Trump is doing the exact same thing in this blatant way, not apologizing about it, it becomes much harder. We're back to this era of colonialism. And as wild as that is to say, that's exactly what's going on.
Before the break, let me ask you one last pestering question on this, and then when we come back, I want to talk about what Congress must, can, or might do. But just so I understand, Professor, is there any plausible constitutional argument that this action fits within the president's unilateral authority? I mean, are we still within any guardrails at this point? I know it's happened, but is there any real argument they could make? Or would their case just depend on a really sympathetic and obedient judge?
Well, I mean, here's the problem, John, that courts really have not been willing to enforce the war powers. They regard it as a political question. There is one kind of amazing moment in the Kuwait War where a federal district court judge temporarily put an injunction on military use of force. I think it lasted a few hours, though. And a colleague of mine at the University of Pittsburgh Law School litigated that. But aside from that, in a couple of cases, there were cases in Vietnam where there was litigation strategy to try to stop illegal bombing. But courts are just not willing to do it. So who has to act? It has to be Congress. And as we were saying before, as Congress refuses to act, it's essentially giving carte blanche, giving permission to the president to do that. When it comes to Maduro himself, Noriega died in prison. I don't see there's any world in which Maduro is going to return to Venezuela. So the damage is done, and the legal mechanisms to fix it are really few and far between. That's not to say nothing can be done. I mean, one of the things, and maybe we'll get to this later in more depth, and I was talking to my friend John in Washington, D.C., a longtime friend who's the best man at my wedding, and, I was feeling despondent, like, what can we do? And his point was so clear and compelling. He was saying, look, what we need to do is compel our members of Congress to act preemptively to stop any more of this, to condemn what happened, but also to stop an action in Cuba, an action in Greenland. And when the Congress uses its war power, we're really talking about a passive failure of them to act and the president's usurpation of that power. But if they were to actually speak up, that really is something that could be done.
Hold that thought, because I want to talk to you about Congress, and hopefully we won't enrage our listeners too much. Because I heard if there's a high enough civilian death toll, the Democratic leadership is willing to write a strongly worded memo. They're really going to do it this time. I mean, strongly worded, Corey. They're going to go full Amnesty International on this. They're going to be like the John Brown of Chuck Schumer gestures. So quick break. We'll be back Chuck Schumer's going to tear the tassels off his loafers. That's how enraged he is. We'll be right back on The Oath in the Office. So, Corey, let's talk about what happens next with this Venezuelan invasion, war, occupation. The reality is, if you want to believe it's about drugs, you have to ignore that Trump just pardoned the former Honduran president convicted of importing hundreds of tons of cocaine. If you want to believe this is about democracy and the good people of Venezuela, you have to believe Trump gives a damn about democratic legitimacy. If you want to believe this is about the Christian folks under siege in a 95% Christian country, you have to overlook the fact that Trump just broke 6 commandments and pretty much everything Jesus ever said. And to believe this was legal, you'd have to believe we still have a functioning Congress. Corey, Trump did not ask Congress. He didn't tell Congress. He did not get an authorization. He just did a war and then announced that we're going to run Venezuela for a while and let very large American corporations exploit its oil. So this is Donald Trump becoming what we said this was going to be, our hemisphere's Putin, kidnapping leaders, ignoring international law, ignoring borders when we feel like it, and using the military as our assassins, as our getaway car, and as our personal distraction device. So a lot are arguing that obviously he's walked past the line of illegality. Congress has to do something. You mentioned before, only Congress can formally declare war. We haven't done that in 84 years. So what are the immediate constitutional tools that are available to Congress right now if this president exceeded his constitutional authority, as many experts believe he did? Congress isn't just allowed to respond. Aren't they obligated to? What can they do?
I think that's exactly the right way to put it, and we were foreshadowing this before. But look, in the absence of courts doing anything to enforce the war power and to stop this illegal action, they're not going to do that. In fact, they might very well continue with the prosecution, allow for the prosecution of Maduro, and he might, like Noriega, spend the rest of his life in prison. So that's not the place to look. Sometimes it is, and we often talk about areas where the court might act. The tariffs case will be decided this Friday, I think. Mm-hmm. So we might have, we'll see, but we might have a limit on the president's power. It's not going to happen here. So there really is only one option, that although Congress has the power to declare war, the exclusive power, and the president can't usurp it, the only way it's going to be protected is if they use it. And if they actually speak up and condemn this action as illegal, that would be one thing to do. And then looking to the future, prohibit explicitly future invasions of Cuba or of Greenland. As wild as that sounds, it looks like all these things might be on the table, or Colombia. That would have teeth. I think then it becomes a lot harder to argue that there's any complexity here. That if Congress proactively uses that war power, it can stop. Of course, there are other things that can stop a president. There are other things that they can do, very practical things like refuse to fund any of these.
That was my
events.
question. Like, can they, I mean, obviously
Yes.
condemnation resolutions are really sexy and get a lot done, but can
Ah.
they actually pretend they control the purse strings? I mean, and can they have explicit prohibitions on future actions? I mean, I know, I don't even see these guys retroactively condemning this invasion for the symbolic power. I mean, could this Congress, if enough libertarians came on board, pass a simple majority resolution barring future military action against Venezuela, against Cuba, against Greenland? Could they do it?
That's exactly what I think needs to happen. And Thomas Massey, and we no longer have Marjorie Taylor Greene, but that wing of the party, Boebert, who talked about America first, who talked about, and might some of them be believers in this idea that we don't want endless wars. All of those things that they campaigned on, that they defined MAGA around, obviously that's all thrown out the window. So we don't need a lot. We just need enough to get to a majority. It's a majority of both houses are required to revoke the war power. One question, and I'm not sure about this, but I'll throw it out there, is yes, courts have been reluctant to act, but this is a unique situation that we're talking about. If Congress were to revoke its war power and the president would, over the objection of Congress, usurp that power and engage, that starts to be, really pushing the court with its political question doctrine, which is sort of a hands-off idea that the two branches can work it out. That's not the two branches working it out. That's really the president usurping entirely the power of Congress. And then if the president were to ignore it, then Congress would be well within its rights to refuse to allocate funds. And that is a real power. And so I think we should be talking about this. We should be, we had Ted Lieu, we had Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. As we bring on this in this new year, members of Congress, we'll talk to them about this.
Would that require 60 votes in the Senate, or just having spines?
Just a majority of both houses. There's no supermajority requirement in the war powers.
Do you think at this point there could be a realistic bipartisan path here, or do you think, Corey, be honest, is fear of Donald Trump overriding constitutional duty? This is going to be the year we're going to see a lot of our Republican friends make the Marjorie Taylor Greene choice and recognize that this guy's not going to help them keep their jobs in the midterm. They haven't all figured it out yet, but I mean, are they still terrified of him enough that he's just going to skate through this?
Well, we saw in the Epstein files there were a lot of defections, and there was a compulsion on the Department of Justice to release those files. This seems to me to be an equally fundamental, if not more, part of the identity of MAGA. At least those who really were believers in it. I mean, that's what you said, was no endless wars. Trump was asked about how can you justify this after you claim no endless wars, and he had it really is America first because we want safety with our neighbors.
Mission accomplished. It was a cakewalk. It was a cakewalk. We were greeted as liberators. These idiots have no idea what the future is going to hold, and it's another example of the reality that Donald Trump is probably not going to be alive to have to deal with the after effects of the things he broke. But let me ask you the million-dollar question on this one, Professor. And this is what they're all talking about in all the chat rooms. Is there any serious constitutional argument against introducing articles of impeachment this week? I mean, if a president initiates an unconstitutional war based on lies, it seems like that is an impeachable offense, even if it's never been treated as one historically. But is the real argument only political? Is there any serious constitutional argument against introducing the articles right now?
I think the problem is, right now, as things stand,
right now,
the president's got his argument, and people like me have our argument, and there's a standoff about whether or not this supposed police action, we know it was constitutional or not. So making the impeachment point is harder now, but that's why, to go back to our theme, if we could get members of both houses to declare the opposite of declaring war, to revoke the war power, then the president defying it obligates the Congress, I would say, to impeach, because one of the main things that Congress is supposed to do has just been obliterated. And, I think that's already where we are. but it just becomes so much clearer. So certainly if we're still in this world and Democrats take Congress, doing both, and if the president were to defy Congress, by engaging in any of these foreign wars without authorization, the case for impeachment is so clear. Now, get in line, right? There are so many things that we could impeach this president for. So, but I'd put this up there.
I mean, we've discussed it before. I'm really on the side of impeachment. I love impeachment, but only for the articles, which is to say, I've talked about it before on the show. Back during
the best impeachment joke I've ever heard.
Oh, Lord, give me some time. Back during the Obamacare battles, we mocked the Republicans for introducing these, kill Obamacare bills every week when they didn't have the votes. We made fun of them. And all along, what were they doing? They knew all those bills were going to failure, but they were reasserting their messaging to their base, right? All the time. We hate the black guy's healthcare plan that makes your life easier. We hate it. They kept on getting the messaging out. They fundraised off of it incredibly. And those nonstop Obamacare doomed to fail repeal votes wound up being a real mission statement that carried them through the midterms. I have believed for a long time the Democrats were handed 10 counts of obstruction by Robert Mueller. They could have tacked those on to the first impeachment over the Zelensky cheating to win the election. I'd love to see them try to do it. I know they won't. But what message does it send to the rest of the world, to the American people, and to historians of the future if this Congress does nothing? I mean, what message does it send about whether the Constitution still constrains power?
Well, and I'll introduce it again, this theme really from the beginning of the self-coup, the way in which, and of course, it's particularly apt because we're talking about a Venezuelan dictator that destroyed the other branches of government in Maduro in Venezuela. And what Trump is doing is also destroying the other branches of government, usurping the powers of Congress, of the courts, and his defiance of court orders. And so, that's why this becomes so essential that Congress act here to reclaim its war power, because if they don't do that, then they're in the same business that the Supreme Court has been, acquiescing in the immunity case. And Congress has acquiesced in other areas as USAID and the powers of Congress to see its own legislation enforced were destroyed by Elon Musk. It's happening again. And, the war power, if I had to pick one, think about it, right? It's the power to invade, to attack a foreign nation is being usurped from the Congress. That really, if they fail to reclaim it, it looks like the self-coup might succeed.
All right. One last question about this then, Corey. At what point will congressional inaction, at what point can we call it constitutional failure? I mean, I know it's too early in the game yet, but at what point do we say they've just stopped being checks and balances?
Well, I think, I'm not ready to call it yet. I think that, as we were talking about, one of the strategies here has to be to try to call MAGA out and say, this is one of the rare areas where the principles, if you want to call them that, of MAGA, no foreign wars, are really directly in conflict with everything this president is doing. And certainly the Democratic Party also doesn't want to see these wars, illegal wars of aggression. So maybe we could start to see the cobbling together of this coalition. That's not going to be stopping the self-coup in court, but it is using Congress functioning as it should be, jealously guarding its own power. The possibility of impeachment remains, especially depending on what happens in the midterms. So no, I'm not counting us out. I think it's extremely precarious, dangerous. The president is really, not just destroying norms, but destroying constitutional democracy. But the we're still in the fight. I've been using the phrase, I'd rather see us in a constitutional crisis than not one, because at least a crisis it implies conflict. And this is a crisis over the war powers. But the fact that there's a crisis, that there's a battle still going on, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. The other alternative at this point is to give up.
And we'll talk for a long time about whether this was a distraction from Epstein files, from a terrible economy, from Supreme Court slapping him down about the National Guard, and from Jack Smith's devastating testimony released by the Republicans in the House Judiciary Committee on New Year's Eve. I want to talk about that. because that would have been our lead story for this episode if this hadn't happened. We'll be right back on The Oath and the Office. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office podcast. Corey, I've been so busy asking you about all of this constitutional malfeasance, I haven't had a chance to congratulate you on having the #2 podcast on Apple in the government category. Well done, Professor. Well done.
Thanks, and I'll throw that back to you, John. Of course, this has been an amazing project. The two of us, you use that phrase, I'm just a mook and I'm going to ask the dumb question, but that's not what you're doing. You're making sure that the two of us are able to translate some of the most complicated issues in law for the American people, for the listeners. And I can't think of anything more important. I'm so glad to be doing this with you, and that's why we reached #2, a new record. I love it that the listeners are into this. I'm into it. As you know, we were 3, was our record before in the government category. Now we're 2.
Awesome.
The other thing is, too, we often, shoot up when we have our amazing guests, like I mentioned Senator Whitehouse or Dahlia Lithwick. If you haven't heard that, you could go back. But our record episode was just the two of us. So that means that listeners are liking this dynamic, and what a thrill it is to do it.
Well, thank you. And I'll remind you again that the self-deprecation I do is just part of me being a charming sociopath. It's part of my approach. Let's talk about Jack Smith. Everyone's debating whether, the Republicans screwed up by releasing this on New Year's Eve. They say they were trying to bury it so no one would see it. For me, New Year's Eve is when most of us are hanging out in the house all day till we go out at night. I got to watch the whole thing. I mean, if they wanted to bury it, they would have released it at midnight on Christmas Eve. But Jack Smith testified very clinically before the Judiciary Committee. What he said was quite powerful, and he testified that he fully expected he would secure convictions at the trial. So let's start with that one. As a constitutional law professor yourself, how significant is that statement, that he knew he would secure convictions at trial?
Well, the parts that I watched, I was so impressed with him. This is a serious prosecutor who was doing his job and was pursuing the rule of law, was enforcing the law against the head of, in the January 6th case, so that really the person that was organizing this attempted, violent coup on the Capitol for the really first time in American history that it had gotten that far. There had been attempts to steal elections before, but not like that. Or in the documents case. And what you see in watching him is how careful he is in the face of really just an attempt to score political points by the House Judiciary Committee and its lawyers. And here he is just giving you the facts. And, I had hope after watching that because, the facts matter. And when you listen to somebody who's as credible as Jack Smith, give these responses, know the cases so well, this definitely backfired on the House Republicans. It didn't make it look like a political prosecution. And then when they tried to, make their arguments like about free speech, he just decimated them. There is no free speech right to
Let me ask you about that. Yeah, because and again, every witness he had was a Republican, and he made it very clear that Donald Trump's conduct went beyond his destructive lies. So, can you explain the constitutional difference between protected speech and criminal fraud? I get why lying is protected under the First Amendment. Why is fraud not protected by the First Amendment? And how does that principle apply to false electors?
I mean, one of in kind of delving into the issue of free speech, one of the huge mistakes that you see so often, and it was used by the staffer of the House Republican Judiciary Committee as they were going after Jack Smith, is to think that somehow just because somebody says something that it's protected. And what Jack Smith did so well, and I'll just on my own show why that can't be right. If you go up to somebody and say, hey, I'm going to come kill you tomorrow, you're using your speech, but that's obviously not protected. It's a true threat, and it's criminalized. And that's true of all sorts of speech, too, like fraud. And here's another thing that you can't do. You can't engage in a conspiracy, which, yes, involves speech, to destroy an election and to violently steal electoral votes. And this is today that we're recording this. Actually, it is January 6th. This is the anniversary, and it's worth saying what this scheme involved that Trump was invited for. They refused to. The plan was that they would get Mike Pence to refuse to certify electoral votes. They wouldn't reach the threshold that was necessary to win the election. That would throw it to the House of Representatives, and the House would vote state by state. And Trump thought he had the votes. Each state in that system gets one vote.
Conspiracy.
That conspiracy is not protected free speech. A coup is not protected. And of course, the irony, to go back to our other story, that we invaded a country because of a dictator who usurped democracy and refused to respect an election. That's exactly what Trump did on January 6th. And yet he invaded a foreign country. I imagine if somebody wanted to invade us, that Trump would have to admit, if he would have succeeded, he would have had to admit that, yes, we could have been invaded and he could have been seized. I'm glad it didn't come to that.
Well, if Russia invades and kidnaps Trump, I'm sure Trump will encourage MAGA to support whatever Putin does. But you're right. We're taping this episode during the day of January 6th. Happy anniversary to all you terrorists who celebrate, because it was terrorism, according to the dictionary. It was terrorism that date. Jack Smith plainly stated Trump caused it. From a legal standpoint, what does causation mean here? I mean, does summoning a mob and then getting them angry based on lies while you're engaging in a criminal conspiracy and then refusing to stop the mob violence, does it meet that standard?
Well, I mean, what he was they had all sorts of things that they could have indicted him for. One thing they didn't, by the way, which is relevant to free speech, is incitement. So at the ellipse, when Trump gives that speech and says, we're going to go down to the Capitol, one thing that Jack Smith considered but didn't do was to indict him for that speech. Now, why didn't he do it? Even though, to my mind, incitement to imminent lawless action, incitement to violence, is not protected speech any more than threatening to kill somebody the day after tomorrow, to use my other example. He could have indicted him. I think he would have not been violating his free speech, but he wanted to stay so far away from the free speech issues that he decided not to do it. Now, why did he indict him for essentially leading this attack on the Capitol? Because the way he put it when he was asked, well, why did you indict Trump? Why not, other people, but not Trump? He said Trump wasn't incidental to all this. He was at the top of the conspiracy to steal the election. And so I thought that was another powerful moment here. And, he really was careful to avoid any of the free speech issues here.
Jack Smith did testify that Donald Trump's tweet endangered the life of his own vice president. And I know, wow, it's so easy to forget about this stuff. But how extraordinary is that, legally, historically?
Well, I mean, just to remind people, I didn't have it on my bingo card that Mike Pence was going to be the hero of January 6th. But, he refused to go along. He evidently consulted Dan Quayle. And it's worth actually getting into the nitty-gritty here. I don't mind doing that. The 12th Amendment to the Constitution, the John Eastman, who was a legal advisor, the former dean of Chapman Law School, told Trump that the vice president under the 12th Amendment could essentially steal the election, that he could refuse to certify the votes because it refers to the ability of the vice president to open the votes in the 12th Amendment.
Right.
And, this is bullshit of the worst kind. And although there was such pressure on Pence, I mean, it's remarkable to think about it in retrospect, not just pressure from the president, but these scenes at the Capitol of hang Mike Pence and nooses.
Yeah.
And yet he didn't do it. He consulted Quayle, he consulted his lawyers, and he knew there is no power of the vice president to steal an election under the 12th Amendment. Now, one good thing that came out of January 6th is we had an Electoral Count Reform Act that made that very clear, that the role of the vice president is just ceremonial. But, he could have gone along with it, and there was so much pressure. So, oddly, Mike Pence wound up being one of the heroes of January 6th.
I guess the other hero of January 6th is John Roberts for MAGA. And let me ask you about the presidential immunity scheme, because Jack Smith was asked whether the Supreme Court's immunity ruling exonerated Trump, and his answer was one word: no. I think that was my emotional high point of the entire process, Professor. But what does that tell us about the scope and the danger of that ruling?
Well, my book, The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, which ends talking about January 6th as a attack on democracy that we really are still facing. That came out the day after the immunity case, and it was kind of a frightening, I'd say coincidence or not coincidence, frightening confluence of events, because The immunity case, to me, if I had to pick one thing that really enabled this attack on democracy, it's saying that the president of the United States, not only when they commit crimes, but when they commit the most dangerous kinds of crimes, the crimes against democracy, an attempt to stay in power, to do what Maduro did, to try to at least attempt to usurp an election, that they're going to get away with it. And the idea that not just a sitting president, but a former president has immunity was pulled out of whole cloth. There was no real precedent. We had a civil case, Fitzgerald, that was about Nixon, but it didn't have to do with criminal destruction of our democracy. And so, yes, when the idea that he's in any way exonerated by the immunity case, absolutely not. The people who are also not exonerated are the Supreme Court, led by Justice Roberts, who really, enabled what we're seeing now, the usurpation of law.
Do you think the Roberts Court protected the presidency, or did they protect Donald Trump?
They protected Donald Trump, and I think they, in some ways, destroyed the presidency. And the classic idea that, the idea of the Constitution is we have Article 1, which creates Congress. We talked about the war power. Article 2 creates the presidency and limits it. Article 3.
That's
and,
right.
They're co-equal branches. That's supposed to be the idea. What the immunity case does is it puts the president in the de facto situation that if they act illegally, even criminally, that they're going to get away with it. Well, what is the incentive there? It's to destroy the other branches. The immunity case is an example, I think, of the way that we've lost our way when it comes to the rule of law in this country.
I mean, if there's one thing these aristocrats on the Supreme Court have taught me, it's that aristocrats really miss having a king. How do you see this ruling shaping the behavior of future presidents, Professor Brettschneider, especially, let's say, future presidents that were fascists but not incompetent morons like Trump? I mean, imagine a fascist less clumsy than this guy with the immunity ruling.
Well, I'll say, in some ways, the presidency has become so much more dangerous than some monarchs anyway. And I've been watching, as you know, Victoria on Netflix. I recommend it to everyone. Watch it. Watch how she behaves. Watch how Queen Victoria is constrained by the constitutional system of Parliament. How, when it comes to an assassin on her life, how she defers to the courts. As crazy as this might sound, the American presidency has become more dangerous than the British monarch, which is constrained by tradition and by law. And, that's what this immunity decision does, among others. It's not the only one. It's also the destruction of Humphrey's executor. We'll see how the tariffs case goes. But over and over, the refusal to intervene in these war powers cases and kind of pulling it all together, what it all amounts to is the creation of an office that is more dangerous than a monarch.
Yeah, I'll say. I mean, and kudos to Jack Smith. He said he had his eyes wide open that Trump will seek retribution against him, which I think reveals a lot about the nature of the threat we're all facing, because we all know that Donald Trump will try to hurt this man for telling the truth. We all know that Donald Trump freed the terrorists who committed violence against police officers, and that his DOJ is persecuting the law enforcement officers who track down the criminals. I mean, is this how constitutional democracies fall apart? Normalizing lawlessness, like rather than a sudden coup, just normalizing the shitty lawlessness. That seems a much more feasible way to make your democracy disappear.
I mean, the January 6th and the attempted coup, which is what that was, violent coup, is a threat to democracy. But right up there, too, is the desire to shut down the opposition. And we've seen Trump, despite Susie Wiles saying that she was going to limit him just to a few days, dig into this to seek the prosecution of Tish James, to seek the prosecution of Comey. Those are all attempts to shut down opponents and to also deter other opponents from challenging him. And when you hear Jack Smith say that, yes, he believes he will be targeted, that's nothing less than the attempt to destroy the rule of law, because what Jack Smith made so clear is that all he was doing was enforcing the law, doing his job. And, there are constitutional heroes along the way. We've talked about many of them, and watching that testimony, Jack Smith is certainly one of them. He was blocked by the Supreme Court in the immunity decision, which essentially stopped that prosecution.
That's right.
But he still continues to tell the truth. And so it was an amazing performance. It wasn't an act of politics. It was an act of integrity. And I'm grateful for him.
All right. So, I mean, if Congress doesn't do anything now on war powers, on accountability, on impeachment, I mean, what precedent are they setting for the next crisis? Like I mean, I think the American people at this point just want a side they know they can root for.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to that Panama example, and as you put it so well, the Panama example was not. I don't think it was lawful, but the fact that it happened, it becomes a precedent, and then on an unlawful precedent, we start to build more illegal actions. Well, if Trump gets away with this, the war powers and the idea that Congress is initiating war, not the president, looks like it's just being eroded. And more, I think we see a risk. Now, that's incredible to say. I didn't even think I'd be saying anything like this a month ago. But if Congress doesn't have any power to stop a president in foreign interventions, there really is a sense in which the self-coup has succeeded. And that's why it's so imperative that we hold our members of Congress, not just to say something, not just resolutions, not letters, to the president or petitions, but really invoking the war power to say, no, you can't use this.
Yeah, on that cheery note, we'll see if that happens. Professor Brettschneider, what's the best way for our listeners to follow you and to keep up with your brilliance the rest of the week? Didn't it seem like we were all optimistic last Friday with Zohran Mamdani? Zohran Mamdani was sworn in, and it was all beautiful, and Jack Smith obliterated Trump in his testimony, and now, boy, they're just bombing South America.
It's a lot of up and down. One thing I'm hearing from listeners is that that we're going through a crisis. It's demoralizing to read the news every day. Some people want to check out. But what I think they get out of this podcast is a kind of solidarity, that we're going through it together. We're not lying. We're telling the truth about how frightening things are, how dangerous, but we're also providing hope where we can. And, in the end, the main theme, I think, of the podcast is even if each of the branches of government abandons the Constitution, abandons the rule of law, it's up to citizens to reclaim it. And that's what we're trying to, be part of here. And so I've still got hope, as demoralizing as this week is. And, so what people can do to follow us is to read our Substack. We have a newsletter, the Oath in the Office newsletter. They can subscribe on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review on whatever your favorite podcast app is. You can check out our YouTube channel if you want to watch us, not just listen to us. And John, really, what a pleasure it is to do this. The topics are just maddening, but yet I enjoy it. And the laughter is great. And we need it.
That's generous of you to call it that. Well, I host the evening programming on SiriusXM Progress, channel 127, 5 nights a week. You can also, if you don't have SiriusXM, hear the John Fugelsang podcast every morning. Corey Brettschneider's a regular every Monday night. I have a Substack, and my book is called Separation of Church and Hate. And I just want to remind everybody, don't panic. The Constitution is still there on paper, even if enforcement is now optional. Corey, thank you so much. I want to thank Beowulf and Wendy and everyone who puts the show together. It's always a pleasure. I always feel less terrorized every time I talk to you, Professor. And we will see all y'all next week on The Oath and the Office.